Yeah, so tonight's conversation, I think lots of you hopefully have seen us doing these chats many times now and know that we've covered all sorts of topics. Last week, we just discussed the idea of virtual versus in real life events. And that is now live actually on our IGTV for anybody that wants to watch it back. That has just gone up today. Of course, incredibly timely, as Rosanna already mentioned, around Fashion Week and all the rules and regulations around the pandemic and that ever-changing entity that exists in that sense. But we've also talked about all sorts of other things. We've talked about sustainability a lot. We've talked about marketing in all sorts of different depth. We've talked about retail and the challenge of reopenings and everything that goes along with that. And today we're talking about content, which, as I said, we're really, really excited about. When doing that previous session on the future of events and what they look like, there was, of course, a huge amount referenced around how important live events are for content marketing, which led us to the point of hosting an entire roundtable just focused solely on that narrow part of the conversation. And it's the sort of learnings from that we particularly wanted to talk about tonight.
And before we begin, I just wanted to say that we are very, very proudly sponsored by Klaviyo. They are an e-commerce marketing platform which work with brands of all sizes and shapes, from high studios to Skinny Dip London. The key thing about them is that they specialize in growth. They've got precision targeting, they've got really powerful insights, and all of that can equip you with the power to grow. I know this is very important to lots of our audience and members. So if you would like to have a free trial, just go to klaviyo.com/FashMash. That is spelled KLAVIYO.com/FashMash. So, Rachel, what has been inspiring you this week?
Yeah, sure. So actually, it's today. As of this afternoon, or I think actually it came out this morning, but as of this afternoon's meeting, a new report has been released by the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Ethics and Sustainability in Fashion. And that's supported by the environmental charity Hubbub. And the report is called Making the UK a Leader in Sustainability, or in Sustainable Fashion, rather, which of course we all would like to see. And it comes off the back of the Environmental Audit Committee's report called Fixing Fashion in 2019, which many of you will remember the government rejected all recommendations from. So it's a really important one. It's really interesting. There was a 2-hour session about it this afternoon with various different participants from across the industry. And what I liked about the report itself is that it shows some really great stats, like the fact that 65% of UK residents, hopefully it's 100% of people on this call, agree that the government should urgently do more to reduce the impact of the fashion industry on the environment. And that also 2/3 of people talked about the idea of slowing down. And what I thought was really interesting about that is that they've talked about the idea that they want better quality clothes rather than volume, which would, of course, be really nice to see. But interestingly, that came from broad consumers and not just from fashion specific people, if you will. So not those working in the industry, but across the board quite broadly. So that's well worth a read, particularly because it provides a really clear breakdown of expectations on government, business and citizens. So it's quite actionable. And I always think, and we talk a lot about the fact that if we're going to make changes happen in the industry, it has to include those 3 different groups. So this is a really nice breakdown of exactly what that could look like. So yeah, well worth a read. And we will share the link to the report so that you can all do so.
That sounds
Rosanna,
brilliant. And
what about
very
you?
promising stats. And
yeah,
for me, now I don't know if this is kind of blowing my own trumpet / self-promotion, but I feel it comes full circle back to our very first IG Live that we did at the beginning of lockdown, when I said that JJ Martin of La Double J was inspiring me with her very spiritual IGTV.
You did, that's true.
About how to cope with lockdown. And I was honoured that she joined me on an IG Live on Sunday. And it was just perfect. It was perfect timing in that, as I mentioned in our last live, I've been really analysing and considering where the industry is going. I know we all have. And it was fascinating to speak to a creative like her who she counters that we do have this superficial side to fashion, but then she is extremely spiritual. And I just was fascinated to pose the question to her about how she reconciles those 2 sides to her. It was a very moving conversation for me and very profound. And if you'd like to listen, it is on my IGTV. But yeah, but personally, I found that really, it certainly set me with a great mindset to confront the week and September, which, as I'm sure lots of you feel, is kind of like a new year in fashion, which kind of leads us perfectly into today's conversation, doesn't it, Rachel? The
It
new year
does.
in fashion.
It does, but also just to say, I think you fully are allowed to blow your own trumpet on that one because it was
Oh,
fabulous. But also, more importantly, what I love about it is how excited you were going in and how inspired you've been ever since. And I think lots of other people agree, having watched it. So yes, everybody go and watch it. It's very, very worthwhile.
thank you.
Lots of positive takeaways. So on to the subject at hand, the next frontier of content. Um, so COVID-19 has obviously been a really fascinating time for evolution in this world, as we've touched on previously regarding marketing, of course. But actually, when we spoke with the members who attended our focus roundtable on this content one itself, there was a real feeling that the pandemic has afforded us the opportunity to hit the reset button with strategy. Now, we've talked about hitting the reset button more broadly with brands in every sense, with everything that's going on right now, and especially when it comes to sustainability as well. But there was that sort of was echoed through marketing content strategy specifically as well. Obviously, Rosanna and I, we both well know the world of content. We kind of grew up within that. That sense of sort of content becoming king was the phrase that we sort of lived by through a good sort of, the last 10, 15 years of our careers. And we've lived and breathed it through the different entities of our own work. We've seen that evolution happening in real time. And now, of course, I think we probably both feel, I certainly do, that there's just so much of it out there all of the time. And I mean that from the brand side specifically, that any sense of real meaning around content strategy, and this is, of course, talking like worst case scenario, it's not the case across the board, but this was echoed by a lot of our members in the session itself. It's just the fact that we've kind of lost that notion of what strategy actually means, and rather what we're doing is just constantly churning out more and more, and particularly churning out stuff that's, of course, the pre-planned posts without really thinking about the deeper values that we want to portray. So of course, when COVID comes along, that doesn't sit right anymore, and nor does it when we're dealing with key movements and matters like Black Lives Matter, as one example. There have always been brands that are, and we've talked about this in the past as well, and I know I've written about it. I wrote about this probably 10 years ago. Brands that are really good at being reactive, very quickly responding to sort of cultural moments that are happening, and good on them. But it's super interesting to think right now about what that all means for content strategy when we're not just talking about a single moment in time when something has happened that you have to address or adjust to. But rather that there are these enormous, huge, unifying things happening around the world that are really changing the face of society entirely. And I think that's really, really fascinating. So there's an opportunity here perhaps to reevaluate, I think is the point. And one of our crew within our focus roundtable said, it's really key we do this rather than just creating for creating's sake, which is sort of where we feel we've been for a little while. And then when we start thinking about our values as well, one thing that's really clear is that we've got to start thinking about how our external strategies align more closely with the internal segments of the organization. And we talked a lot about the fact that there is no point creating inclusive content around Black Lives Matter, for instance, when your organization itself isn't diverse, as we talked about, as you interviewed Dior Bediako in our last FashMash Pioneer Speaker event, which, if anybody wants to watch, that is available via our YouTube channel. Essentially doing that is purely performative, and consumers can see straight through it. And what I love about all of this side of the conversation, which obviously is just one segment of it, but this side around values, is that there's just so much for us to think about and talk about in terms of the changing face of that landscape and that sort of impact that we're seeing across society. And indeed, what the very notion of brand purpose is in terms of particularly, I think, where it aligns with social justice right now. So I'm going to propose, Rosanna, I think we should do a future session that is solely focused on that, because obviously it's so huge. We can't go into it in full detail tonight, but I think there's a lot more to say, definitely. Anyway, so point being, for me, content strategy, I think, has to be thought about as much more than just churn, which of course links us really, really nicely back to the whole Fashion Week situation that we have going on right now coming up.
Yeah, I mean, Fashion Week. They have long been a time where the industry the industry relies on this moment, these biannual months, although obviously it's expanded and expanded and it's become more and more of a traveling circus, and it's no longer just February and September. But traditionally, this was when brands created their content for the season, for 6 months. And that was for retail marketing, that was for online marketing, you know, catwalk imagery, backstage imagery, and that has since expanded into street style.
Yeah.
The landscape has transformed since the digital revolution in terms of the volume of content being created. It's no longer just catwalk looks, but the importance of it, I don't think, has diminished. You know, let's not forget, and I think if we're talking about content around Fashion Month, we need to begin with the much maligned peacocking that Susie Menkes described back in 2013 in her article for the International Herald Tribune, the circus of fashion.
Oh my God, I remember that piece so well. I remember it so well. It really did,
viral, and a lot of people had retorts to it, and I loved it because it was provocative and it was something that a lot of people were thinking, and it needed to be said. But it was a polemic around the street style set and the fact that people were no longer watching the catwalk shows, but they were watching what was going on outside the catwalk shows. Susie flagged that a lot of the street style set weren't even going into the show. And, you know, this was back in 2013. When I looked it up today, I didn't realize that it's actually been that long.
I know, it's crazy, isn't it?
Yeah, it is no longer new, but there seems to be as much demand for it. At least last season, there seemed to be as much demand for it as ever. And certainly we were lucky enough to have Moise on one of our focus sessions, who is a brilliant street style photographer, award-winning. And he said that the demand from brands is very much still there. Now, from photographers to influencers, they would travel from New York to London to Milan to Paris, often not even attending the shows, as I mentioned, but they would be earning huge contracts. So these are brands of all shapes and sizes who wish for these influencers to showcase their design. So I think, first of all, what we need to confront is if that is not happening from a financial standpoint, that is going to impact content creators.
Yeah.
As I mentioned last week, Copenhagen Fashion Week fizzled without influencers and without street style. Those are not my words, they're the words of Vogue Business, but it's an interesting viewpoint. And so there are fees at stake, and there is also buzz at stake here, and brand relationships pushing to, these are brands that need to push to have that impact post-pandemic, to make those sales. I suppose we need to ask ourselves what is appropriate. One big change since last week. So this time last week, Rachel and I were discussing IRL versus URL events. And we were speculating at the time because the government announcement was only about to be made. I think it had been made that day, so conclusions hadn't been drawn. But we were speculating that Fashion Week, in London at least, because of the new rule of 6, could not take place. However, since then, London Fashion Week has been able to justify its few physical shows that are taking place as performances rather than social gatherings. So they are going to be allowed, surprisingly, I would say. Rachel and I have been invited to a couple, and they do underline, you know, these are shows that will have hand sanitizer available. They will be socially distanced, so there'll be 2 meters distance between each participant. They are outside, so they are respecting the guidelines. From an intellectual standpoint, I think that is going to give a fascinating perspective to watching a show, because you're no longer feeling a pressure to comment immediately to your peers either side with your clever quip about the styling, and you can instead watch the show and absorb the show in a much quieter way. And actually, I think that's something that many of us have been craving. So, you know, and either way, these are audiences under 30. These are not going to be the huge audiences that we are used to seeing. And I suppose it's therefore lacking the social aspects. Henry Holland, again, we mentioned this piece last week, but he wrote a very interesting piece for the Evening Standard, a comment piece. He's no longer showing at Fashion Week because his brand House of Holland is sadly no more. And he said that the social aspect is so key to Fashion Week.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah, that's it, it's like any trade event, like I mentioned last week. The closing words of Imran Ahmed's article for Business of Fashion are very pertinent. Many major French brands, from Chanel to Louis Vuitton, are still courting influencers and celebrities to attend physical shows and seem comfortable with the increasingly poor optics of staging large-scale fashion events while a deadly virus continues to spread in the community. For now, the attitude appears to be the show must go on. I was also really interested to read an interview with Camille Charrière. She is an influencer, London-based, Notting Hill, but Parisian-born. She has nearly 1 million followers, and she was interviewed by Bethan Holt for The Telegraph. Now, she did see both perspectives, and her concluding point is worth pointing out here. But I found it very pertinent from an influencer to give this strong a viewpoint. What's the value of being away for weeks, watching shows back to back every hour? How on earth are you supposed to digest what's happening? So she's going to skip Milan, but she will still do Paris, where she says she has various partnerships, and obviously she is partly based in Paris. Her argument here was it's a very fickle industry, obsessed with newness and constantly moving forward. So we feel like we need to keep our place.
Interesting.
So one season off, even mid-pandemic, might risk one falling out of fashion, whether you are a brand, whether you are an influencer. These are the concerns. Actually, they hark back to the article Sweatpants Forever, which I've mentioned many times before. Scott Sternberg discussed skipping Fashion Week in New York as a designer. And he mentioned the same concern, that if you skip one season, you're no longer relevant. So Camille also discussed, and it's worth saying, like I already have, this idea that these are brands that need supporting now more than ever. So there is that viewpoint as well. But as an influencer, even though she sees the value in pausing and not doing as much, because to her point, how could one possibly digest all of those shows every hour on the hour? She will still be attending in some form in Paris. That exposure and that support for the brands.
It's kind of sad, I think, in some ways, isn't it? The sort of the feeling that you can't, even though, to Imran's point in that Business of Fashion piece, even though we are like in the midst of a really deadly virus, that you can't just skip a few shows because you might end up losing some of your influence, or in her specific case, or indeed, from the brand's perspective too. And it's quite mind-blowing to me in many ways that's sort of the feeling that sort of sits alongside it.
But I think it's something that we have all experienced. I've found for years in many different ways. So when I was working at the British Fashion Council, for example, obviously my job was to be, I was looking after all the digital content. My job was really to be in the office, working on the website, uploading content. And yet at the end of the day, if you hadn't been out there networking, and often that would mean, even if you've worked a 12-hour day in the office, which I love doing, this wasn't saying I was very heavily overworked. I did that out of choice. I loved it. You'd still feel this pressure to go to the events afterwards because you had to be seen, you had to be networking. It's true. A lot of women have expressed it to me since I've had a baby, and they've said, oh, you're so lucky that we're in lockdown, because you're not getting this, that you don't have this feeling that you need to be out there going to industry events, networking, and as a consultant, networking, no doubt, for projects, for jobs. It is a plight of our industry where you need to be seen.
Yeah, it's true. And I certainly do feel that as well, from the networking side, particularly, that's, when we go to events or conferences, in my case, particularly, that's when so much of potential business and opportunity comes your way. That said, I'm still very much at the mind, like we're in the middle of a pandemic, and actually, it's just even the travel to me is kind of mind blowing, that actually, maybe there needs a bit more pause. But anyway, our conversation obviously more broadly around content, rather than the event aspect, which we did last week. It's just changing all the time.
It's front of mind, and it's changing so much. Exactly. As we saw over lockdown, the influencers have power to be sellouts if it's done in the right way, with or without Fashion Week. And that was a big conclusion of our focus group when it came to content.
Yeah.
Influencers have as much power as ever, and it doesn't need the Fashion Week street style to exhibit that power. They will need to play a bigger role in the foreseeable, especially for smaller brands. But brands need to be cautious around pushing for real life attendance, I feel, and I know that our members feel, even at smaller events, because this cancel culture that I think is so omnipresent this year, it could come across as really poor taste to consumers. And we've all seen it getting called out from brands. I've seen a lot of where photos aren't properly social distanced, brands call it out. Consumers call it out to the brands.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's the point there. Exactly. It's not so much around the sort of the individual choices as to whether they want to attend things or not, but around this sort of from a brand perspective, they need the influencers. That totally makes sense. And there is a lot of potential when we're talking about content marketing specifically. That's the sort of the route to go right now, without a shadow of a doubt. There's so much potential in that, probably more so than ever, I imagine. But there's just, there really, as you say, there needs to be that caution around the real world events, especially as if you are a small brand, because there's a lot of risk attached to it, and you just don't need to be in a scenario right now where there is, that sort of calling out going on. So really interesting. I guess from my perspective, what I'm interested to hear from you then is that, if we're sort of saying that in many cases real world's going to be out, more digital is going to be in, I'm really interested to think, like, where do we think the majority of engagement is going to take place, whether it's right now or indeed during Fashion Week itself? So I read a really interesting piece that was saying that Fashion Week organizers themselves are, of course, really pushing the platforms where the live streams are going to live and the films are going to live, and they're trying to obviously get people to congregate on those platforms themselves. But in doing so, they're kind of negating the fact that so much of this is, of course, going to happen over social, as it always does. So I'm interested from you, is this a marketer's worst nightmare in terms of people just being everywhere? Or is it actually a huge opportunity in terms of different types of engagement through different platforms? And what are the platforms that you're most excited about this season on that very note?
In terms of opportunity across various platforms, from a consumer perspective, I feel like we are particularly now we're no longer in lockdown and people's time is getting tighter. You've got to opt for the platform that is native to the user, and you've got to go where the users are, or where the online audience already is. And that's where I do obviously see the purpose in creating these Fashion Week dedicated platforms. But for example, the one from Couture I found quite confusing. And I also think it kind of reminds me of back in about 2012, a lot of brands started creating microsites. And there would be the main brand's homepage. But then, a great example was, of course, Art of the Trench from Burberry, which was an awesome microsite. But all of the good ones eventually got absorbed into the main site. It did not require a separate website, even if it was a microsite. It was still somewhere separate for the user to go and potentially be confused by. Then in terms of platforms, and I feel like this evening I really risk sounding like a broken record between JJ and now TikTok. So for me, it has to be the darling of lockdown, which along with Instagram Live was TikTok. And I feel that TikTok's success has continued after lockdown, despite the ongoing debate between China and the US, potential purchase, which is now no longer going to happen with Microsoft. I do feel that is this short form video content. This is the one to watch for this season. Now there's the competition in the form of reels, and actually, viewers, I would love your opinion here. Do a little poll: who prefers which, TikTok versus reels? Hit us up in the comments. I would love to know what you think. Personally, I am veering for TikTok. I find that the editing tools are much superior. It's kind of like an Adobe Premiere Lite, and then also the fact that the For You page is so brilliant in that it targets, and first of all, when you go on the app, it's the first thing you see, so you are seeing content from completely new people who you do not follow. So as somebody who has perhaps a small following on that brand, on that platform, it is possible for your content to still go viral if it is fantastic content. And that, from a marketeer's perspective, is hugely exciting, and that from a small brand's perspective is hugely exciting. That algorithm is the magic touch, I feel, for TikTok. So then I'm also fully aware that it is Gen Z, and I've seen it myself. You know, this is not therefore potentially a commercially driven content decision for brands right now. Short form video, it's also worth saying, is not a new conversation. Who remembers Vine back in 2013? Oh, yeah.
Do you remember Meerkat?
No, I actually
That was
don't.
before Vine. That was before Vine.
Does anyone remember Meerkat? Heart as if you do. Rachel, I think you might. Wowza.
Well, I used to write about these things, if you recall. So yeah, that's what I was tracking. And then Twitter stepped in and bought Vine, and so that pushed Meerkat totally out of the way very swiftly. It was really interesting.
The Vine conversation, we don't have the link for Hannah to share, but Rachel did write about some Vine London Fashion Week activity I was doing back in February 2013.
Gosh, well remembered.
It all goes back to 2013, really, from Susie Menkes' article to Vine short form video. It raises the debate for content creators at brands, just like Vine did back in the day. So I think Vine was quite scary back in the day because, like TikTok, it was kind of best if you were creating in-app. I think at first, in fact, you could only create in-app. So it was raw. It was an insider take on things. And brands across the board seem to be playing it safe, much like the early days of Instagram, which is not what you should be doing. One should be doing on a new platform. You know, think of the brands when you flick through stories on Instagram. One of our members flagged this on the focus session, who treat stories like a perfectly curated advertising billboard. This is not the narrative platform for that. Likewise, TikTok isn't the place for a perfectly directed video. In the words of one of our members, if you're too afraid to try new things and get creative, then don't be on the platform. Brands are often held to higher standard in terms of quality content, and this fear of judgment may be holding them back from standing out. And I think that's something that we all need to consider, and that brand creators need to consider.
Totally.
So TikTok, Fashion Week wise, just like Vine did back in the day, because I know that they had some great partnerships, TikTok is actually teaming up for Fashion Week specific content. It is kind of almost having its own fashion month, from Louis Vuitton to Saint Laurent and JW Anderson. I'm personally really excited to see the JW Anderson partnership come to fruition. I'm sure lots of you know about the Harry Styles viral cardigan moment, which then resulted in JW releasing its own free downloadable pattern, which was fantastic. But will the 800 million active users globally of TikTok be open and desiring a fashion month on their platform, or are they kind of more after quirky dances and creative quick how-tos? Is that more what they're looking for? Linking back to the influencer discussion, with brands turning to them to showcase their collections, I feel like the winners here are the ones who can create dynamic short form video in their own at-home studios and not rely on, you know, professional street style photographers to get their snaps, which was kind of the traditional way for influencers to work way back when in 2013. Many influencers had told me back in February that their audience were tiring of the Fashion Week content, that it kind of stunk of this elitism, which just in 2020 does not sit right with the current consumer sentiment.
Yeah, oh my gosh, I couldn't agree more. And I think you've raised so many interesting points there, but I particularly like the one around, you know, thinking around how you create compelling content in a way that feels very sort of native to the platform. And as you said, like, this is a conversation again we've been having for years, and it isn't even just with stories. Like, I remember when Instagram itself became this platform that brands needed to consider whether they should be on, and at that point in time, obviously the quality of the photo, the quality of the phone, was very different, and you could only upload from a photograph you took from your phone. You couldn't upload any content that you had yourself and everything else. So, you know, a lot of brands were like had to be very creative around what they did and didn't do, because they all wanted to just put their ad campaigns on there. And so it's kind of the same conversation that we were having back then, you know, again, you're probably around 2013 or whenever it was, saying the exact same thing, that actually it needs to be much more raw, much more sort of natural and organic content. And I think it's just kind of the same thing all over again, really, isn't it? Which is really, it's really interesting that we're sort of still going through that same thing. And hopefully there are a lot of lessons in that. There are always brands that do a really good job of it. And I'm excited, as you say, to see those ones on TikTok particularly, and what they do. And hopefully, you know, to your point of whether it will or won't work for that audience, hopefully a couple of them will recognize what that audience likes, and it won't just be a case of like seeing a catwalk show on TikTok. It will be a bit more creative and interesting than that, because there is obviously some really exciting things you could do with it, which
absolutely. Think of Nick Knight shot backstage at Topshop Unique back in the day, and his photos were utterly exquisite.
I remember
Sean Cunningham shot backstage at Burberry. They did a tweet walk. I mean, there were major photographers shooting in app back in the day, and the content that they produced, you know, a fantastic creative is a fantastic creative, regardless of whether they're using a DSLR or
whatever it might be. Exactly. And obviously the quality of the phones today is so much different as well. I remember Burberry did a Snapchat campaign, which was actually a sort of pre-reveal of a collection. It was going to be on the catwalk the next day, and they previewed it on Snapchat, and they did it as if it was this amazing narrative of somebody basically breaking into the Burberry store and finding the new collection and stealing it. So you sort of saw everybody trying it on. It was really clever. And that was sort of when Snapchat was like the platform everybody was talking about a few years ago. So again, like, you know, there is some amazing creative work that can be done. Actually, talking about Burberry, that's one of the ones I wanted to mention, just thinking about other platforms as well. So they've got their digital only show on Thursday this week, and they've done a partnership with live streaming platform Twitch. Which I'm sure everybody knows, but if you don't, that's the one that's particularly famous for gamers watching other gamers, and millions of them concurrently in some cases. So I think that's really, really huge. It's super interesting. So Burberry is going to use Twitch's squad stream functionality. So what that means is that different hosts host different live streams together in one video. So essentially it means that you can get different perspectives of the show all at once. Now, I'm not a Twitch user, so I don't really know what that means, but it sounds very interesting and quite exciting in terms of the potential. And there's a little description here from the Burberry CMO. I've just got a quote. It says, "Twitch unlocks an exciting new space where our Burberry community can be digitally transported to feel like they have a virtual seat at our live show," which is of course what everybody's trying to achieve. It is an interactive experience where guests can connect with both our brand and each other whilst personalizing their viewing journey. So I think there's like a chat function as part of it as well. So that I think is going to be really, really interesting. And I think, you know, to our point we were just saying, I think it's actually been, to me, it feels like a really long time since we've seen a genuinely innovative approach to content streaming. So I'm really excited about this one, and I'm excited about the ones that you mentioned on TikTok as well. You know, this may end up being just, you know, like many other standard experiences, but I'm hoping it will feel a bit more interactive, as mentioned. Plus, and this is a bit that's key, I think it's going to tap into a very interesting broader audience, much like you said with TikTok, you know, that Generation Z. You know, is this a Burberry shopper? Maybe not in many cases, but it's certainly a clever way to reach that broader, younger group of individuals. So we'll see. Definitely one to look out for. So that's on Thursday this week. So do take a look. And I think this leads us on really nicely to our final point for today, which is really only a brief one, as we did indeed touch a lot on this in our last IG Live. But that's to say that we're seeing a whole world of further content opportunities not yet being fully explored in fashion to their full extent at all. And that's, of course, when we start looking at sort of more tech-enabled entities. So things like augmented reality, all the way through to a lot of the experiments that are happening with 3D fashion, digital garments, and so on. And one of the things we talked about in our roundtable that I just wanted to emphasize again is that there's a real sort of need for bravery and for risk taking here, which when we've talked to our community about this, we've got so many people that are really eagerly waiting for it. And I think that's what makes this so interesting. I think for anybody that wants to keep on top of the latter topic of virtual fashion or digital garments specifically, do check out the work of Corinna Nobbs. She was on our roundtable and is certainly one of the foremost experts in this space to date. And she was saying that, the fact is that there's just a lot of brands that are just not ready to take the plunge in all of this. But there is, of course, enormous amount of opportunity sat right there. She talked about the fact that there are, of course, budgetary issues, and we've discussed that tons, obviously, over the last few months with everything that's been going on and everybody being in somewhat of survivor mode. But there's also, it's more than that. There's also a lot of fear around the unknown, which, of course, we see really happening in fashion so often. Just this idea that we wait to see what competitors are doing before willingly making our own move. And I think what that means, and again, what we talked about last week, I think it was a point that you raised, Rosanna, is that there's a true leadership play that's to be had here. It's sat there, it's kind of wide open with everything moving more and more digital currently. It seems like such an opportune time to do it. Corinna is obviously helping to shape that. So I would just say, watch this space. I think we are going to see some more and more exciting things within all of this. Maybe some during Fashion Week, certainly beyond. And I think that it's quite exciting, the potential of the innovations that are sat right there waiting for us to grab hold of, basically.
And I also think that, as ever, if we're going to see innovation, I really do believe strongly that it will be in London. The huge budgets aren't always here, but the risk takers are, and the bravery is, and this idea of the
creativity.
The creativity, exactly.
Yeah.
And this is a capital that has, if Imran was saying that Paris is very much still caught in the idea of the physical show, London is, there are minimal, I think last time I checked there were 7 purely physical shows. So most are going for the digital option, and it will be fascinating to watch what they all pursue.
So you will be downloading Twitch for Thursday. I will be getting on TikTok much more so because yes, I've never created a TikTok, I've never created a reel, so maybe I need to experiment with those and get up a little bit to speed before talking about it properly. And yeah, we'll see what happens during Fashion Week. How exciting.
Yes, indeed. Thank you all very much for watching, and thank you so much to our sponsor Klaviyo, and we will be back, I think, next week. So see you all then.
Yeah, see you soon. Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Thank you.